Our history here is written in the rocks, in the layers of geology that expose a story reaching back millions of years to the time of the dinosaurs. And human history in this valley is literally carved in stone. The stories of the ancestral Pueblans are right here in front of us.
Ayak nu punikai maanoni im tangwanting mamauting. Ayak imi pitch ivanto tuvipur nuni tuvip. Nu kaiveting siviting mamauchung. Nu kanikant maba.
In the mid-1800s, Euro-American explorers and settlers encountered the southern Paiute, a peaceful people of the land. They lived in small family units that formed bands with shared language and culture. When we talk about beginnings, the Paiute people are our connection to the original stories of this place. In the 1860s, Latter-day Saint pioneers arrived in this valley to start a new life.
We're on the campus of Utah Tech University at what we call the Encampment Mall, which is a prominent area in the center of campus where the first settlers in St. George camped when they arrived in the valley.
Well, my middle name is Erastus, and my great-great-great-grandfather led the expedition to St. George in 1861. He was tasked to head up the Cotton Mission, or the Southern Utah Mission, and Erastus headed up the group that settled St. George.
Brigham Young began to look at how those folks could colonize throughout what became Utah, but it happened because of his amazing organizational ability.
I give a lot of credit to the university for saving this spot and recognizing it as an important part of the history of this valley.
Where I'm sitting right now is right in the heart of what those original pioneers to southern Utah called the adobe yards. But it was also the place where they first camped when they came over the Black Ridge and came into this valley in November of 1861. We're sitting right where those original 309 families came, and on the monument behind me are the names of all of those families that came here. It's an amazing thing to go down that list and to consider what they might have been thinking when they came here, how much courage it must have taken for them to come and to start a community really with nothing except what they could fit in their covered wagons.
Well, this really was a remote outpost. This was 350 miles from Salt Lake City on the old wagon trail. You had to either take with you what you needed, or you had to be able to find it when you got here, and there wasn't much here.
It was just a meager existence when they arrived here. This is where they came together with all their dreams and hopes to build a community here, and they did it in the most difficult of circumstances. From the moment they got here, it was a question of where do we get our water? How do we get enough water? It's the exact same question that we continue to ask today. They were praying for rain, but it didn't rain, and it doesn't rain much here, as we all know. But on Christmas Day that year, it started to rain. And it didn't stop for 40 days. And those 40 days of rain created so much flooding and so much havoc that it nearly washed them out of the whole valley.
My roots go back very deep here in this southern Utah area, and especially right here in Washington County. Water was always an issue here, either not enough of it or far too much all at once. All we heard from those ancestral stories was just survival to settle this, what they said was God-forsaken land.
They found out immediately what a complex situation they found themselves in. They were ready to start a new life here, but with those meager provisions and with the very slightest of goods, they were so isolated here that they had to figure out how to make it.
The biggest concern was the river. They just had a terrible time taming the river.
I remember reading a pioneer journal that said, "We didn't know what to do with the Virgin River. It was too thick to drink and too thin to plow. People would take their barrels down to the Virgin River, draw out water, take them back to their homes, and then wait for 3 days for the mud to settle to the bottom so they could drink from the top."
And then it was a matter of being able to put dams in the Virgin River and divert water for their farms and for their crops. And that was just an ongoing effort year to year to year to year as floods would come and wash out their dams, as they would build again and try to water their fields.
They'd get their crops in the middle of the hot summer, and then there'd be a flash flood, the dam would fail, and they wouldn't be able to save their crops. The river probably was their biggest obstacle, but there was heat like they were not used to, well over 110 degrees during the summer. Mosquitoes, varmints that are here in the desert that are difficult to deal with. It was very difficult to get people to come, number one. And secondarily, it was very difficult to get them to stay once they came and saw what was here.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
The song, Once I Lived in Cottonwood, and of course it's about a couple who come down in a wagon and they have a couple of horses. And by the end of the song, it's been long ago when their two horses are dead, long ago dead.
My wagon went for sorghum seed to make a little bread. And poor old Jim and Bolly long ago are dead. There's just me and Betsy left to hoe the cotton tree. May heaven protect the Dixieite, wherever he may be.
I am fortunate to have come from original pioneer ancestors who settled this area. I am so grateful that they had the vision of what this area could become and what it has become. It required neighbor to help neighbor, community to come together. And that spirit of collaboration, community, service, and grit is really what became known as the Dixie spirit.
Come thou fount of every blessing.
And from that next spring, they went out into this valley and created a community.
Of mercy never ceasing.
It was a group of farmers and horticulturalists and butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, artists and musicians. And you could just about name everything you would need to build a community.
The mount I'm fixed upon it.
Brigham Young referred to it in a letter. He called it Utah's Dixie back in the 1860s. It was a convenient way to describe why this community was established. Just like in the South, they came here to raise cotton. They raised grapes, they raised melons, they raised pomegranates. So these were crops that were typical of the southern states. And so it was only natural that people would start referring to it as Utah's Dixie.
The 309 families that came to St. George came with a very strong common bond. They were of one faith. They were responding to the call of their prophet to go on a mission to establish this city in the desert.
And we still feel the effects of that today, of a can-do kind of community that is still in some ways isolated, geographically, politically, and in other ways, that is still here and still thriving and still leading in so many ways. And it really does harken back to those first people who came right here and said, we can do this, we're going to do this. It's truly amazing, and I attribute that to what has come to be known as the Dixie spirit.
Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above.
From the beginning, a certain spirit began to grow among those who chose to stay. It was a spirit of survival tied to family and to education.
These weren't just frontiersmen that came, these were families. So there were a lot of children. Early on, the need for education was identified.
It's interesting that as soon as they set up their wagon boxes, they began school. And school started in those wagon boxes, even before a home was built in this valley. So education was always key to life here.
Charles Dickens was writing about the Mormons that were getting converted and leaving England and coming on a ship. And he said, these people, these Mormons, are the best educated poor people, basically, in England.
And then as time went forward, just as today, the need for further education was apparent. So schools came about for high school and then also the St. George Academy.
One of the things that saved and why it worked here, why people didn't just give up on the Cotton Mission and Dixie, was because there were public works jobs. So the tabernacle first, followed by, in 1871, by the temple, they got more organized.
They'd had practice, obviously, cooperating as communities and building large projects. They'd built the tabernacle and the temple, they'd built the courthouse, and so there was this process of joining together as a community and cooperating and building these public buildings was already pretty well established by the time they took on the new college building.
One of the great Dixie stories is the odyssey of a young man named Nell Sanderson. In 1908, which was just a few years before the St. George and then Dixie Academy came into being, a teenage hobo from Chicago got kicked off a train near Clover Valley, Nevada. He was coming west with the idea that he was going to try to find his way to Panama because they were building a canal down there. When he was kicked off the train, eventually he made his way to St. George, where he then became a student at Dixie Academy. And what he discovered with the help and support of community members is that he was a scholar. And by the time he was finished here at Dixie, he was voted the student most likely to become President of the United States. He went on from here to New York University, Chicago University. He earned a doctorate in the early days of sociology. In fact, he's known as one of the founders of that discipline. In the meantime, he had gone to France and fought in World War I, survived the killing fields of France. By the time the Depression hit, he was well known in the area of sociology, and he became a protege and a kind of a lieutenant to Harry Hopkins, who was Franklin Roosevelt's key person in creating the New Deal. And so there he found himself very close to the Oval Office, probably as close to the Oval Office as anyone from this town had ever come at that point. It's just a wonderful example of how someone who was kicked off a train in a valley nearby came to Dixie. His life was changed. He went on and realized his potential.
Well, this was a very small school, a few hundred students. There was a period of time that there was no funding available. And that was a time of great sacrifice for the faculty. And for a year or two, I mean, there were some of these faculty members that they didn't get any salary from the school.
They kept the school alive, kept classes going during those 2 years by the barter system.
Oh, we came here from a farm down in Bloomington. We're flaming youth. We've come for some education. We brought our wood to pay our tuition, and we're going to stay, so there.
As students would come to go to college, their family might bring a beef, or they might bring some chickens that would cover the tuition. Or maybe they gave the lumber from the tree that they cut down.
You just think about how difficult that would have been to suddenly have no salary, not knowing for sure if the state's going to fund it.
So that there again, it's that ingenuity, that innovation, that we can do this, we'll figure this out, we'll keep this institution alive. In 1950, the Dixie Education Association raised the money to build the Dixiana dorms, and that became the first formal dormitory for women. And that process, again, was completely community-inspired and community-funded.
When I came down for my interview, they were building the Dixiana, which is a girls' dorm, which they didn't have any place for girls. And when I went to see the president, he was up on the roof driving nails, putting the roof on the Dixiana. And all the teachers were there working, didn't get paid one dime. And all the teachers on the faculty were there building the Dixiana so we'd have a place for girls to stay. Yeah, it was a unified thing by the community that saved this school.
Later in the 50s, when the state was looking at closing down colleges like Dixie in the state, the fact that the community had built that Dixiana dorm was one of the factors that played into the governor and the legislature realizing that, hey, this community cares about this, this community has ownership, this community is passionate. They will keep this institution moving forward. And so once again, it went through a difficult time where it could have just as easily gone away. There were, during those tenuous years, different challenges, and a lot of it had to do with funding, but a lot of it had to do with having a critical mass of students for the institution to thrive. And so there were legendary recruitment efforts during all of those years.
And so when my father came on the scene in the 50s, and he'd been here and played here, he seemed to have embraced that Dixie spirit.
1953, 54, they were going to drop the school because the enrollment was down. So when I came, it might have only been a one-year deal, because the president said if we don't get enrollment. I told the president, I said, just let me have the school car and pay the gas and my hotel bills, and I'll just spend the whole summer. That's all I did.
But he was on a mission, and his mission was to recruit students for Dixie College. I remember sitting in that back seat, the four of us, the four little kids, traveled with him around the state of Utah recruiting football players and cheerleaders.
First got the job, I went to Kanab. They had 12 in the graduating class. I knocked on every door, both boys and girls. And I promised every boy they could play football, and every girl was going to be a cheerleader.
And, you know, it's amazing the number of football players that ended up marrying some of those cheerleaders over the years. After 1 year, they doubled the enrollment, kept the school alive, and then from that point forward, he built a very successful football program.
I think, along with the town and the people that all worked to bring these players in, hadn't been for the football team, where we had 50, 60 players on the team, when the school only had a little over 100 students in the student body, that I think football was one of the great determining factors in saving the school.
And that helped the college continue to grow as well, because that was a rallying point. Coming to this Sun Bowl, playing football games in this Sun Bowl, it was a rallying point for the whole community. And then during the fall, when they brought the rodeo in, they turned it into a red sandy turf. And so it was that way the rest of the football season. And I like to think that they did a really good job of cleaning up afterwards. I hope they did. I think they did.
The people who came together in each of those instances did it out of pride for their community and their school. They painted the giant block D on the Black Ridge to the west. Over the past century, every year, students have gathered during D Week to give it a fresh coat of paint. The word Dixie was painted on the red bluff they called the Sugarloaf.
I attended Dixie High School, and if you earned a Sterling Scholar Award in your senior year, you were chosen and were eligible to be able to rappel off the Red Hill and paint the Dixie. I remember that so vividly, they almost had to push me off because I was so terrified. But once I got off the edge of that hill and I put my own white paint on that sign of Dixie, I felt so connected to it ever after that. And it's been such a great memory for me, and it's a tie to our community that so many of us experience.
It was that same spirit that allowed those first settlers to make it through. We're here in this Southland, we're isolated. We used to grow cotton. Now we're trying to grow really great people and educated people. That spirit that was at the center of all of that. The people of St. George were determined to build a college because they knew in the long run, education would be key to the survival of their community. The college grew and flourished. Lots of really great, legendary faculty members. I'm a little bit biased, but my grandpa, A.K. Hafen, was one of those, and he was the humanities department. He taught English, Spanish, and German. Juanita Brooks, who is truly legendary, she wrote a story about a faculty meeting one morning in 1928. President Nichols was presiding, and he started the meeting by saying, "We're going to offer a sabbatical to one of our faculty." At that time, they may not have even known what a sabbatical was, but he said, "You can go for a year of education off to a university at half pay, and then when you come back, you'll have your full-time job with the raise." And he said, we're going to offer this first sabbatical to A.K. Hafen. He's the one who's been here the longest. My grandpa said, "That is so awesome and that is so wonderful, but I can't accept it. I have children at home and my wife. I couldn't leave my family and go off to school, and I couldn't take them with me." So he turned that down. And so President Nichols went on to the next in tenure and the next in tenure, and each of them, for some reason, were not able to accept it. And then it came to Juanita Brooks, and she said, "President Nichols, don't look at me. If you're going to offer that to me, I will accept it so fast it'll make your head swim." And she did. She went to Columbia University in New York City, and that is where her legend, her legacy as one of the greatest writers of the American West really flourished and began. She came back to Dixie and taught all through those years. But I like to think that it was my grandpa who helped her, helped open that door for her to make that step in her life.
Her reputation and the influence she had on education here in St. George was significant. She was described as having a brilliant, sensitive, and creative mind. I consider her by far the most acclaimed scholar to have set foot on this campus. She was fearless in her effort to learn and to communicate the truth. And some of it was hard to hear, and some of it was beautiful to hear. And I think that's what makes her a whole person.
But she becomes this world-class author. Mountain Meadows Massacre is her most noted book, but she was a great historian.
And she is a phenomenal storyteller. She does her research. It is quite accurate. I know during my time with the LDS Church and church history, we'd done a lot of research about the Mountain Meadow Massacre. And 50 years earlier, she had it pretty right, you know, and she didn't have access to the records that we did with the church, but she got it right.
Her writing, I think, was just like her, you know, brilliant, creative, and honest, even when the truth is hard. And I think that's what courage and integrity is. I think as a woman, she really did some significant groundbreaking and pioneering and trailblazing, which is what our mascot is.
The level of commitment to education was just always very, very high here, well beyond what we would expect from a small town.
You go back to some of those really great professors. They could have taught anywhere, but this is where they wanted to be, and they made a great difference in the lives of many, many people. And they set that standard, that academic standard of excellence that is still part of the university today.
Certainly my top 10 professors ever throughout my academic career, and I have a PhD, I would say 5 of them were here in my associate degree experience. So significant scholars were here for such a small institution that I think transformed many lives, not just mine.
Andrew Barnum is a great example of a scholar and a professor who could have gone anywhere. He could have taught in the highest echelons of academia, but he stayed at a 2-year college, Dixie Junior College, and taught on a level that was so low for him because his mind was clear up here.
I wanted to stay at Dixie. I was not satisfied with everything that I had accomplished at Dixie. I wanted to build a museum, and I wanted to continue to teach here. I wanted to continue to teach in small classes. Back in Iowa, I was teaching classes with 350 students, and it was a drudge. You probably knew the top 10%, the bottom 10%, the 80% were unknown. And I didn't want any more of that.
I have not had a more difficult course than what I had from Andrew Barnum, and now I'm so grateful. Science is what my doctorate is in science education. I'm so grateful I had the influence of Andrew Barnum on my education.
I think I've been successful here. I think I've made some contributions. I think I'm still making contributions here by even directing the museum, by getting acquainted with the students, by getting acquainted with the faculty, by getting some things accomplished that I've always wanted to do.
Dr. Barnum's fame extended well beyond Utah's Dixie. During his career here, he was offered the directorship of the Philadelphia Museum of Natural Science, and the same at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C.
I want to continue teaching, and there was no teaching at either Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. And so I turned down both of these jobs. Probably the 2 most important jobs in my particular field in the entire country, if not in the world. And I turned them down.
Any regrets?
No, none whatsoever. I have never apologized for staying at Dixie.
He was here when I was a student. When I came back as a professor, he was here still. And really, he stayed and oversaw the museum in the biology department, Natural Sciences Museum, but he stayed here and oversaw that until, I would guess, a year before his death. So he is a legend here on campus, and they have a statue for him over by the Science Building.
I'm going to stay here for as long as I can. And probably they'll find me early some morning, and I'll be stone dead, but I'll still be here in the museum. But I'm planning on continuing until then. I could probably think of 1,000 things to add, but we were about out of time.
According to who?
And I talk to people all the time who say, I came to Dixie, I didn't know where I was going or if it would even work, but someone took me under their wing and mentored me through.
Actually, I grew up in Salt Lake City, and my father was a truck driver. And he drove from Salt Lake to St. George, and he said, did you ever think of maybe going to Dixie College? So I came with him on the truck. He dropped me off on the highway, and he said, I have no idea where Dixie College is, but go into the service station and they should be able to help you. And so that was the reason I was called to Dixie. And I was a very lost, lonely person. I hadn't been away from home, and I was thrown into life at Dixie College. It was probably the worst experience I ever had in my life. I had no friends. I hated it, so I was sitting on the steps of the Fine Arts Center with my tears rolling down my cheeks. This lady by the name of Rowene DeFury walked up to me and she said, wow, you look like you could use a friend. She said, how about you get in my car and we go up to Larson's Frosttop and have lunch? You know, Rowene was the most dynamic individual, and you always felt like you were the only #1 person in her life. So I stayed around, and wow, my life changed tremendously. I get emotional when I think about it. All of a sudden, instead of me getting D's and F's in school, I was getting A's and B's. And Rowene brought that out of me. Her main thing was bringing people together. She brought generations together and started a group called the Program Bureau. And they would go out and perform at different events in the community. Then it became a recruiting tool for Dixie College. Rowene became the heart of the Dixie spirit. And that's what kept this school alive at that time, was the heart of the Dixie spirit and that unity that she brought. Her presence, I mean, she was a large woman. So when she walked into a room, you knew she was there. And I always tell people that Rowene needed double doors to go through. And they said, oh, double doors? I mean, isn't that kind of rude because of her size? I said, no, it wasn't a situation of her hip size. It was that Rowene had to walk through a door like this. She had to enter the room. And so she needed double doors to enter the room. So Rowene had written the song, Just for Now.
We get sentimental whenever we hear the school songs of Dixie or meet with the old gang.
The words are so embedded in all of us that came to Dixie.
And wonder why such happy times cannot last. But
you know, every time you hear that song, it brings back, you know, what Dixie and the memories mean to us. So I do sing it at a lot of funerals. Go to the cemetery and you will see a lot of gravestones that say "Just for Now" on them, of the people that went to Dixie and that the heart of Dixie went with them when they left us.
But we must, though it's just for now.
People began to discover this place for their own reasons.
My wife Nellie and I were born and raised in the Los Angeles area. After we got married, which was in 1971, and we had our first child, we moved here to this little pioneer town, which it was then, one stoplight in this town. At that time, there was so little going on here that only two young hippie kids could even think that they could come here and make a go of it. But the thing that really brought us here, my wife's father was a building contractor, and he acquired some land up on the east boundary of Zion National Park, 5 acres with thick ponderosa pines. And then that became my focus was, wow, this place is unbelievable. Zion National Park. I called it my solace, a place where I could go and have peace. My own ancestors were called by Brigham Young to come and settle St. George in 1861. Well, people are pouring in here now at an unbelievable rate. We just can't even comprehend what St. George has turned into. And I think Brigham Young, when he had his vision of what this community could be and looked over this valley, and he said there'll yet be built between these two volcanic ridges a city with towers and spires and all these people. He could see that somehow. I don't know if he saw McDonald's arches and some of those things, but visually he saw towers and spires, and that's what this town has now. The growth of that, I think, is stimulated by especially Zion National Park, Snow Canyon, the Red Cliffs, the scenery that's here. It's like a magnet. It draws people to us.
Before we decided to buy a home, it was New Year's Day. I had walked into Snow Canyon and I'd fallen asleep. And when I woke up and I looked up, and all I could think of was, this must be the moment that the 16th century monk who penned the words, "How great thou art." And I looked up and I said, and just that feeling, "Oh Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the world thy hands hath made, I see the stars, I hear the roaring thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed." And in those words, "Then sings my soul." And that moment of how great thou art, these mountains and the red sand full of the richness, oxidized by the sun, the volcano, so you have the red, the white mountains, and then you have the volcano. And that was just, for me, it was, this is where I want to be. It takes your breath away and then it gives it back to you.
And the feeling is the intangible part. Why are people coming here? Well, it's not necessarily just because of this and of that one thing, but they have a feeling for the place. And that feeling is strong.
Dixie College became a destination for many people whose lives were changed here. One was a confident young high school basketball coach named Doug Allred.
I had an opportunity to bring my Delta High School team down to St. George to play in a brand new gym. And I can remember I was absolutely dumbfounded with the beauty of it. I remember distinctly asking my wife for a little piece of yellow stationery. Had birds on it and, you know, the little tiny feminine stationery. I wrote a letter, "Dear President Bruin, my name's Doug Allred. I'm basketball coach at Delta High School. Would you consider me as your basketball coach?" Well, about 2 or 3 days later, I got a phone call from President Bruin, and he said, "You're my new basketball coach." So that's how I got to Dixie. The student body was loud. The community was loud. You couldn't hear yourself think. I had to holler at the kids at timeouts. I thought I knew everything. I was young. I got here when I was 28. Nobody could tell me anything about basketball because I knew everything. And I was up giving it to either the kids or the officials, and I was out stomping my feet, and he hollered, "Sit down, Allred, and start coaching the team." I swallowed hard and sit back down. The first year I was here, and I do not know to this day how that bunch of kids gathered together, but I ended up with 12 ragtag, a kid from here, a kid from there, a football player, a basketball player that had played 2 years ago somewhere else. But I don't know what happened. It certainly wasn't a coaching style. I attribute it to the spirit that was here. Those kids, for some reason, they united and they won a conference championship. But I can remember distinctly
the spirit of that bunch of kids that first year. And I attribute it now, didn't at the time, didn't know anything about the Dixie spirit. But as I think back, I think that spirit, I know that it encompassed that bunch of kids. But I realized that you had to recruit good talent. Coaching wasn't enough. You had to bring kids in that were talented. Let me mention the name of Lloyd Booth, a local St. George kid that was coaching in Vegas at the time. One of Lloyd Booth's Rancho High School basketball teams. It was an excellent team, and I think maybe 3 of his 5 starters were black kids. Without exception, his gifted kid was Lionel Hollins. But I invited him up, and I remember distinctly the day they came. At that time, you didn't come up through the gorge on I-15, you come up over Utah Hill. That coming off Utah Hill, coming into St. George, there was a pickup truck following them. And they said they followed him all the way into town, and they were right on our bumper, and we were scared to death because it looked like a bunch of cowboys. I think that was the initial start of recruiting the black kids into our community and our environment. But I think it was about that time because I had a wonderful feeling about the sincerity of that guy. He was a gifted athlete. Talent-wise, probably something that I hadn't coached before. But I remember the first night, Lionel ends up with 22 or 27 points, and they all came easy. But I told Lionel, I said, Lionel, that was phenomenal. But I said, we're going to play a little different style. You're gifted. Use one of those gifts to include everybody on the team. Take your shots. Make sure the other kids get their shots. And from that time on, he didn't average 27 points, but he could have got them. But I don't remember in coaching Lionel 2 years here, and this is quite a statement, but I don't remember him taking anybody else's shot. I think many times it was his maturity that superseded my obnoxious attitude at times. And if you look in those yearbooks, you'll find out that Lionel was the most preferred man. I thought it was a wonderful experience for him and for us. An emotional time for me.
Through the years, the coach and player remained close. Lionel Hollins went on to play for Arizona State before he was drafted by the Portland Trailblazers, where he won an NBA championship in 1977. He's since been a successful coach in the NBA.
I love the community. There were a few rocky moments, but those rocky moments were always tempered by some other gesture that made those moments more profound. When I went to look for a home to rent, I was waiting for the realtor to come. When I'm sitting there, a police officer came because someone in the neighborhood had called. And the police officer walks up to my car and says, may I help you? And I said, I was not in need of help. So clearly there was someone in need of help, and it was not me if he had received a phone call. And he said, well, I received a phone call that there was a suspicious person in the neighborhood. And I said, well, I have been sitting in my car for 15 minutes. What was the suspiciousness of the suspicious person that you are looking for? Because I have not seen anything suspicious. The woman who I was renting the home from drives up, puts her finger into the police officer's face, and she says, what are you doing accosting this woman? She's coming to look at my house to rent. At that moment, I was thinking, well, I'll just go along with it. There's no way I'm going to rent a house in this neighborhood. And actually, the next day, I received something from the city of Ivins. At my home in Las Vegas, they had found my address and had sent a fruit basket from my home to say I was welcomed here. I hadn't even moved. Someone called me, I didn't even know. A neighbor who said, I heard your husband was sent on a tour duty. I want to come by and mow your lawn every week until your husband gets back home. I didn't know this person at all. But these kinds of things happen. They'll never make the news, but we have to know them, we have to be them, and we do them for others. I bet you more casseroles have been delivered in this community than in any other place, because that's just the kind of people that live here. They care about each other. I always say that's the paradox of a life story. There's always multiple angles and ways to see it, and we get to choose which one we're going to hold on to. When I would call people and I would say, my name was Janice Brooks over the telephone, they'd say, are you related to Juanita Brooks? I said, well, I don't know. And then I would meet them in some place, and then they'd look at me and say, oh, and I'd say, you never know. And so the cultivation of the spirit of Dixie, and how does that live itself out with our growth and our new neighbors? We're not throwing away something that's significant in our history, because I believe that with all the triumphs and tragedies, both have such great significance to us. We're a vibrant place. We're growing by leaps and bounds, one of the fastest growing cities in the nation. And so our neighbors are new neighbors. And our new neighbors come with a different set of language, put it that way. Because in the end, it's just a word. How does it live itself out in terms of the actions that I spoke of, where a welcome basket was sent to me? How does the spirit of the place and the inhabitants who say, we're a place that welcomes all, we're a place that believes in family, which is why this place resonated so much for me. We're a place that believes in kindness and the goodness of spirit and caring for each other. And how do we do more of that? And what name might be given to that 100 years from now that we have created in this community?
So much culture, so much art. You wouldn't naturally expect it from such an out-of-the-way, dusty desert town. I think if somebody did a deep study, they would find that there's a disproportionate amount of artists in every discipline that have either emerged from this community or have been affected deeply by this area.
Such an interest in the arts in general, and that speaks not to the musicians or the artists, but the love of the people for the arts. I love what human beings can do in the arts. And that love of it is abounding in this community. The support that we have for the arts here is fantastic, a beautiful thing. And I think all of that has helped to make this a special place.
My heritage, my family came from Nauvoo, Illinois to Salt Lake City, and then they were sent to St. George to settle. And when they came to St. George, one of the first things they started to build was the Opera House and the social hall. The culture encouraged the arts.
But I think that the interest in the cultural arts in general today, when the pioneers got here in 1861, Brigham Young told them, make a social hall. I want to see dancing. I want to see music. I want to see people having fun. And he understood that that was necessary to make them happy, that break from the hard labor. So they built a little social hall down here. And then not too long after that, they built the Opera House. They called it an opera house, which had a moving floor that they could turn these cranks and move it down for theatrical productions or up for a dance.
even understanding how that stage was made in the Opera House. And that Brigham Young felt that it was very important to have theater, opera, music, and art. It makes us better humans.
She looks so neat from her 2 white feet to the shine of the nut brown hair. And the thought came yet I had to shake myself to make sure I was really there.
When Dixie Academy College was small in the 30s, half the curriculum was in what you would call arts, music, especially performing arts, because they made their own entertainment. And that tradition of entertaining yourself, having the musical and other talents, was just there from the very beginning. In other words, they didn't rely on traveling troops. We entertained ourselves and had the skills to do that.
They decided to build a Flicker Emporium in St. George, Utah, which was probably one of the very first Flicker Emporiums outside of the big cities. And that was in 1911 that they did that. The Flicker Emporium then became the Electric Theater. And the thing that's great about it is that Electric Theater has gone through the history and it's still being used today.
Yeah, this is a fascinating place, and it's just full of history, full of art. They had plays and productions, and they barely had places to live. Well, that feeling has come down through this community ever since. Not just visual arts, but music and theater and instrumental orchestras, bands. They're all been a part of this community and full of people who support the arts and make the arts. What a great place to live.
So Roland Lee, the word genius.
Roland's work, it exudes wanting to capture and share something special. He's been painting Zion for 40 years or more, but he's also been painting historic buildings and structures of our area all through those years. If you want to look at someone whose art and whose character are completely intertwined, it's Roland Lee.
I had never really thought much about fine arts, as in painting a painting that's going to go on somebody's wall. At the time I was teaching college at Dixie College, I became interested in watercolor painting, and that was due to one man who moved here at the same time I did, and his name was Robert Shepard. He came here to retire, and he started doing landscapes in watercolor. And I looked at those landscapes and says, that's what I want to do. And I hadn't done watercolor before. It was in Zion, and I told another member of that workshop, I says, this is it for me. Watercolor is going to be the thing. I'm going to do something with this. I said, I give myself 2 months to perfect it. And she said to me, she says, you can't say that. It takes years and years to develop it. But in that 2 months, I became assured that I was going to be a watercolor painter because I launched into it. It was within the walls of Zion National Park with those huge, huge cliffs coming up and the ripple of the Virgin River running through and all of that. I'm going like, why can't I do this all the time? And it wasn't probably a year after that I quit teaching and went into painting full-time. There was another new person that came in when I did who really became the face of Dixie College in the community, I think, and his name was Glenn Blakely. Glenn Blakely was a master potter. He studied it. He could talk about glazes, I think, which was his specialty, and he was very involved internationally. He would travel abroad at least once a year. Probably took 1,000 people from the community with him on these tours all over the world. But what he did with more than teaching students was he actually brought the community together with the college and was a unifying force. Glenn didn't just stay on campus, he reached out. Eventually, he's the one who helped get the St. George City Art Museum going, and he was the director of it. He did stay there his whole life, and he passed away about a year ago, maybe just a little bit more, and he was a great loss.
Art cultivates goodness, and sometimes art provokes and prods us. Sometimes art makes us think about the deeper questions, even when people may say it's provocative. Its purpose is to create both a conversation within ourselves and a conversation with other people. I certainly would like to see more art. I think we can't ever have too many artistic venues, more galleries, more concerts. These are the things that nurture. In many ways, there are vitamins and our minerals that help to make us healthy human beings so that we can engage in conversations with individuals when we are healthy ourselves. And so for me, it always has been music and culture has been a way to view the world, not just from what you see, but also from what you hear, because there's a visceral reaction to that. It makes the heart swell.
All these little pockets of interest are supported in kind of a petri dish that has all of the essentials for this growth that we see, and it just flourishes. We've developed some visual artists that have gone out of here or are still working here from that college, and Del Parson, who's taught there for a long time, his works are known internationally.
I think it's interesting. It's strange. To me, I also go, it's creepy. It's a little creepy, but that's okay. Yeah.
This whole place is, if someone moves here and tried to do everything there was, it would be impossible. Every night is 4 or 5 different productions of some kind.
My son was cast in a play at Tuacahn in 2002. As a child actor, he was 12 years old at the time, and we went to see The Sound of Music, and just blown away. They had the dogs in the scene, the cars on the stage, the horses. Maria arrives from the top of the mountain in the back, and it was picturesque, and my son said, "Mom, I want to perform at that theater."
But the productions that go on in this town now are fabulous. Such an interest in the arts in general. I've made a living as a visual artist for 50 years in this town. Well, I couldn't earn a living if it wasn't for beautiful people who want to hang my art in their homes and offices.
So it's a symbiotic relationship between those who produce it and those who are patrons. And that creates a real synergy in a community. It helps us to care about each other.
Matt Clark is a perfect example of the Dixie spirit, of how tragedy and struggle can be turned into triumph in art.
I specialized, I guess you'd say, in found metal object welding. Where these pieces have been broken or discarded, thrown away, I like to take those and repurpose them, if you will, give them a new life or a new entity.
As a boy, Matt Clark rode horses and dreamed rodeo dreams. But his horseback dreams died suddenly at the age of 17 when an accident paralyzed his body from the chest down. The accident broke his physical frame, but it didn't break his cowboy spirit. He learned to be independent, graduated from high school, customized his truck so he could drive himself, and built a workshop from the ground up. Before long, he began blending his skill with the torch and his can-do cowboy spirit with the newly discovered sensitivity as an artist.
So I take these pieces that have been thrown away symbolically like I was, recommended to check into the rest home, and reincorporate them or repurpose them into a new entity. I'm not interested in what the pieces were before. I'm looking at their shapes and how they fit with other shapes to create a new whole, a whole new entity.
One evening several years ago, Matt invited me to meet him at Ancestor Square. When I got there, he was seated in his wheelchair next to his latest creation, the painted pony. Before me stood a compilation of scrap metal, discarded pieces of farm machinery, gears, pipes, frying pans, and utensils. Somehow it was all assembled and connected into a perfectly conformed quarter horse. And not just an object that looked like a horse, but the true essence of an animal standing on fragile fetlocks. I've walked through some of the finest art galleries in the world. Never have I felt more in the presence of art than I did that night at Ancestor Square. Because of the chaotic terrain of Utah's Dixie, the railroad never made it to within 50 miles of St. George. For decades, the only way in or out was on rough, rocky wagon trails. In the early 1900s, as the horse and buggy gave way to automobiles, better roads were built, and the original Arrowhead Trail Highway connected St. George with Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. And before long, St. George became a way station for travelers. Zion Canyon became a national monument in 1909. Roads were built, giving travelers much easier access to the canyon, and tourism began to grow. Zion became a destination for travelers from all over the world and spawned an entrepreneurial spirit that helped businesses grow. Highway 91, which is now St. George Boulevard, ran right through downtown St. George, and by the mid-part of the century, it was lined with gas stations, restaurants, and motels.
I wanna be down home in Dixie, where the hens are doggone glad to lay. Scrambled eggs in the new mown hay. You ought to see, you ought to see my home in Dixie. You can tell the world I'm going to D-I-X. I don't know how to spell it, but I'm going. Yes, ma'am. You bet I'm going back to my home in Dixieland.
You know, in the 50s and 60s, as better roads were built, and then in the early 70s, as I-15 was extended on through the gorge and connected Southern California with Salt Lake City and Denver, and we were right in the middle of that transportation corridor. That's when things really began to change here, and all of a sudden, people were coming here because they wanted to. People were coming here because this was a great place to be. It's awesome to think that in the same way that this was a place that spawned the arts in such a meaningful way, that spirit of ingenuity also came out in those who were more business-minded. This was and still is a community where you can walk down the street and you can talk to an artist and then walk a little further and talk to a farmer or rancher. And then you walk a little farther and you can talk to the founder of the largest commuter airline in the world, at least the United States.
I've always loved airplanes. It's a miracle, isn't it? You can take a big hunk of metal and put it in the air and it'll fly. And they say that if you can get any object going fast enough, it'll fly. But airplanes are just such a neat invention of mankind. Makes us find our dreams. At a very early age, I developed a love for airplanes and for flight. I was born and raised here. I was born in 1943. We had a population of about 2,500 people, and it had been stagnant at that for probably 40 years. And I was elected county attorney, and it didn't pay very much money, but it did pay the rent and gave me an opportunity to start a private practice. And then it was just only a month or two later that 2 college students come into my office, and they had been involved in a whiplash injury. So they hired me to help them get some compensation from that. These were students at Dixie College. One of them was a flight instructor out here up on the Black Hill. I said, man, I've always wanted to learn to fly. But when we went up and took that first flight, I mean, I was hooked so bad.
Smokes,
and that's what led us into the whole flying business.
I'd vote for you. I mean, check it out, guys. I'd have your baby.
Yeah, we had some friends that all of us wanted to learn to fly. We got together with our friends and said, you know, we all want to fly. Why don't we buy a little airplane?
The airplane right there, the Piper 140, got a really good offer on it. $11,000.
We all said, yeah, well, let's do that. And so we agreed to put up $500 a piece just to get a trainer, you know, like a Piper 140 Cherokee.
Once Ralph Atkin learned to fly and owned a plane, he thought, why not buy an airline?
Bruce Stuckey basically had a lease on the St. George Airport, and he had a couple airplanes that had been involved in what was earlier known as Dixie Airlines. He really didn't want to be in the flying business. And so I talked to Bruce about buying the rights to that from him. We put together about $50,000 to start the airline without assistance from anybody else. In those early days, it was difficult, really difficult to make payroll each week. The first 3 years, we lost money. We tried to sell it. Nobody would buy us out. So we said, okay, we're going to pony up the rest of the money and we're going to make it work.
And Ralph Atkins called me on the phone one day and said, hey, we've got this little airline down here that we're flying and I could sure use your help. Why don't you come down and go to work for me? And I went, well, wow, I didn't ever think I could go back home to Dixie. And I think I said yes almost on the first conversation. It was a small community then, and there wasn't a lot to come back to. So I'd always kind of thought I would do something else somewhere else.
And he said, what would you think of getting on a little single-engine plane and riding to St. George? Uncle Ralph has offered me a job.
She was pregnant with our first child, and I don't imagine that was quite the first thing she wanted to hear right at that moment.
And then he told me this story about this little airline. They were trying to get going, and I thought, well, we may as well go hear him out.
He says, look, it's a mess. I don't know where we're at. You know, but I could sure use your help. And I think I was caught up in the idea of being able to go home where I didn't think I could ever go home to before that time.
For him, it was really scary. He had just walked away from an accounting position and started with the airline.
All I knew is that every day at the bank, we had more checks come to the bank for payment than we had cash in the bank to pay for them.
I remember Jerry coming home from work and saying, I'm not sure our check will clear the bank today.
It was a tough business. It was not a glamorous, well, there's the glamour was that you were flying. You're flying airplanes, and it was exciting.
I knew that it was airplanes, and you know, I didn't know anything about aviation. I knew something about accounting, I knew something about business. And we did have a board of directors, gratefully. And so they said, Jerry, why don't you put together some kind of a plan? We don't care about how grand it is, but put together what it'd take to salvage this place. And all I did is put out what the expected revenue was going to be which meant the cost had to be something less than that, and everything else had to go.
I was looking at things that I hoped the airline could be, and I was the dreamer. And I've been accused of being the dreamer, and that's okay. You gotta have dreamers. And Jerry came along to help that dream come true.
Ralph Atkin had the guts and the dream to start this almost unfathomable thing. Ralph dreamed the plan and I carried it out, I guess.
I watched people in the company that were willing to do anything that needed to be done to make the company succeed.
Just stuff that anybody in Dixie would really do if they wanted to do it, is just get it dumbed down to something that actually made sense that you could do.
I began to understand what the Dixie spirit, what that meant.
So off we went to the races. This is really gonna work. Maybe. And SkyWest today, let me try to paint a picture for it. We carried 40 million people last year. We have over 500 jet airplanes that might be the biggest fleet of small jet airplanes in the world. We have 13,000 employees. We serve 44 states in the US and locations in Canada and in Mexico. We're the largest by quite a ways of an independent survivor of this 30, 40 years of thrashing around that I'm pretty proud of and our people are very proud of. We considered a number of times whether we should move somewhere else, and each time that we did, we came up with a conclusion that we didn't want to lose the can-do attitude of the Dixie people that work for us in St. George.
SkyWest became a partner with the community, as did Dixie College at that time, as did the hospital.
I was going to become the administrator of Dixie Medical Center. Dixie, where did that come from? Obviously, it's pretty easy to see. It's painted on the hillside not far from town, and there's a big D on the West Hill. I learned from many in leadership positions at the hospital that were well connected to the community that had pioneer ancestry. I learned that there were 2 doctors that were sent with the 309 families, Dr. Silas Higgins and Dr. Israel Ivins. And they were prepared at any time, day or night, to jump on a horse or get in their buggy and take off to be of assistance. Dr. Ivins' principal means of diagnosing a patient's illness was to examine the color of their tongue. J.T. Affleck was the first physician who had been trained in medical school in Philadelphia, trained as a surgeon, who found his way to southern Utah. The bag that belonged to Dr. Affleck. This was a bag that was worthy of a surgeon in the late 1890s. It was made of walrus skin, and all of his tools are still in the bag, including cat gut for suturing wounds, as well as whatever other equipment he may have needed is in this bag.
In 1913, Dr. Donald McGregor and Dr. Frank Woodbury established a hospital in a 2-story boarding house in downtown St. George. In 1952, in a fine example of the Dixie spirit, county residents pooled their resources to build the Dixie Pioneer Memorial Hospital. That facility expanded in 1975 to become the Dixie Medical Center, and in 1990, the Dixie Regional Medical Center, setting the stage for greater things to come.
I was introduced very early on to the idea of the Dixie spirit. It was a barn-raising mentality. If there was something that needed to be done, we just need to get the right people together, get organized, and go do it. My first introduction was getting a call one afternoon as I sat at my desk that there were some people in the main lobby that wanted to see me. I went to the lobby and I met 7 12-year-old girls who came from Washington and presented to me $17.50, which were the proceeds from their lemonade stand. And they told me they wanted it to go to the construction of the new cancer center. I was extremely touched. The idea of Dixie Regional Medical Center and its new location and building that facility, the estimated cost to be well over $100 million, was another tall order for the community. But when we bought the first 50 acres, there wasn't a river road. There were tumbleweeds, but we visioned that this would be the perfect place for it. The community raised over $10 million to contribute to the new hospital, and Intermountain Healthcare got behind that. We bonded and built what you see behind us. And it has gone so much beyond the cancer center, the human genomics laboratory, all of the things that are taking place here, open heart surgery. As I look back on my career, it was one of the most satisfying experiences that I've ever had to be a part of developing something that changed the level of care for an entire region. I would like to make a gift of Dr. Affleck's bag, finding a place of honor to put that in the main lobby of the hospital. I think we need to do more as we go along the way to recognize those people that made a difference. The reality is, we don't achieve anything on our own. It all comes as a result of those things that we've learned from those who pioneered before us.
The Paiute people were here for centuries before my ancestors came, and those ancestral Puebloan people were here even earlier. We have artifacts of habitation going back 10,000 to 12,000 years. And so all of that is such an important and integral part of this story. There's so much to tell and to consider and to really be sensitive about.
My name's Gary Tom. I'm from the Kaibab Band of Paiute Indians that located over by Pipe Spring. A lot of times when we're as flute players, it's very enlightening to sit and listen to the water, because that's where some of our music comes from, if what we're trying to listen to, what we're trying to compose. And so we'd spend a lot of time in nature, whether it's in the mountains, you listen to the trees, the wind spirit makes those sounds for us. Something even in your ear, small as a little bug, could give you some pitches that you listen to and play from. Birds, all of these different sounds that surround us, would have to listen very intently, with your heart rather than just listening to the sounds.
Anta Ichuk, Ayak nu Punikai Maanoni, Im Tangwansing Mamautsing. Nunin Yaner Karma Dudahits Grayman. Good morning. It's good to see all you people here today, you men and women. And it's good that you're here on this land of ours, this Tuvipur, our land, our homeland. I am a Shivets, which we call the Sivit, Shivets Paiute, one of the 5 bands. So like these mountains up here that you're looking at, the red mountains that we wake up to every morning, which is so beautiful, they're the Ankakaib, they're the red mountains. But our people traveled, and they knew where the water was, they knew where the plants were. From what I understand, they were great botanists. They knew the plants that were used for medicine. They knew the plants that were edible. They knew the plants that were poisonous.
I felt like, these people had the best of all the worlds, the upper Colorado River Basin, the Great Basin, down here to the desert. So they'd migrate. Being nomadic people, they traveled by foot. They were one of the last tribes to get the horse. And for the most part, they would follow the animal. The mountain sheep, a lot of deer, you got the cats.
Our Shivets people, too, were involved with Powell when he came down the river. And he used our people as guides. because he said they didn't need to have a map. They knew every crook and cranny of the area because they traveled it. Our people have been here for time immemorial, they say, and so they know the land.
A good friend of ours that wrote a book about the petroglyphs named his book, And the Rocks Began to Speak, because in essence they do.
I'm Shenandoah Anderson. I grew up on the Shivwits Reservation, which is the land we're sitting on right now. And so if you look at a petroglyph, you'll see a lot of spiral petroglyphs, so that's telling you that it's something going up. And then the opposite is going down. And so if you have a circle within a circle within a circle, it's similar to a trunk. You know how the trunk has all the rings? So it's saying to go bigger, bigger, bigger. A sign for water or wind is this. It's a variety of different things. Some talk about taboos, some talk about graves or battles that had happened. All throughout my childhood, we would sit with elders. They would talk to us in Paiute. Some of the ladies would tell us how to bead. They would tell us how to tan hides. They would give us little secrets on how to cook, like the brains to the deer, how to cook it so that it would tan the hide better. I know how to make bows, I know how to make arrowheads, and it's just like I wanted to learn everything. We went to gatherings, we went to ceremonies, we went to powwows, and we danced, and we would just sit with people.
They practiced the traditions, their ceremonies. My grandmother was a basket maker, a cradle maker. My grandfather was a singer. He sang the Mountain Sheep song. And he said the Mountain Sheep dance is a dance that was created long, long time ago.
Because of our family lineage of being from the Mountain Sheep, we honored the Mountain Sheep. And so my great-great-great-great-grandpa, his name was Sawap. He was the last of our Mountain Sheep song keepers. Nobody could go out and do the hunting without going to him first to ask to do a song for a good, successful hunt. We have a story about a major drought one time. Years ago, the Mountain Sheep stepped forward and said, "We will sacrifice our life for you so that you can survive and you can live."
Grandfather tells that Os went up into the mountains and he went hunting. He brought a mountain sheep down. He brought that mountain sheep home, and then his son saw him, and then his son created a song. It needs to hear those words. It needs to hear those songs to Dunkakar, to hear it. Ka, Nach, and then there's a story that goes along with that mountain sheep, how he became the North Star. And so they'll remember it, because in our way of life, everything here is alive, even the rocks. Everything like that dance has a purpose.
So we were a simple people. We were song people. We sang for everything. We didn't feel that it was a hard life. It was just life. People always ask us, how did you live in the desert and how did you survive? And to us, it was just everyday life. We would go from camp to camp. Going 100 miles in a day or two was nothing for us. And so we just traveled on foot to all these trails, and that was just life.
When the Spaniards came through, we had the part of that Spanish trail up above, up in the old area. They would invade our encampments and take our children and sell them into slavery.
Well, that was the first time a lot of people had actually seen a bearded white man. That was an era of just going into hiding and being standoffish because they didn't know what to expect or what to think of these explorers that came in. The women and kids would stay in hiding. Like, it wasn't a happy time because they brought in a lot of things that took over the land. And to me, it just seems like when they came, we kind of went into hiding.
Paiutes weren't a real fierce people. They could be angry, but they weren't a warlike people. So a lot of those things that the Europeans brought their thoughts to us and said, you do it this way. Forget about your ways. That's not good. That's one of the changes that came with the Mormon church. You know how they appoint people? or set them aside or whatever. Well, that's what they did with the Paiutes. They said, okay, you got to have a boss, a president. It never used to be like that. There was a leader, but he always took the people in and they talked about it so that they came to a consensus. Our people used to be great in numbers. We had so many bands, but they're gone. They're all gone. The Tokerville people are all gone. They were wiped out. The Donequin people were all wiped out. When the Europeans came over, they brought their sicknesses, and the people were not used to that. They had no medicine.
And that's sad because anyone that had first contact, they died first.
And so once the Europeans came in and they brought in the cattle and the sheep, they ate all the natural foods that the Paiutes had, that they would gather. So that drastically changed our lifestyle.
We killed the wildlife to eat, and so when it depleted the food, then the animals went somewhere else. Our people started to starve.
But we're overcoming that, and my thoughts are that is, and too, my dad always taught me, you're just as good as a white man, except that you're Indian, your skin's always going to be brown. Don't be ashamed of it. But those are things that we have had to overcome and carry with us, just like other people of color.
I feel that our tribe right now is working a lot better with being independent with our convenience store and our gas station, and we have all these little businesses that are coming up that is helping us, and that's what I want, is for us to be self-sufficient and not depend on anybody, but be able to do it ourselves. And so today, I was actually going to publish it yesterday, the website, Nuwu Paiute. Any of our tribal people can go online and they can access any of those stories, the language, everything will be online.
I'll always live here. This is my home. I'm tied to this earth. When you have a belly button, they call it your sukubi. When that falls off, the mother takes it and they bury it, either by a bush or by a tree, wherever you were born, near there, so that you will never get lost. You will always make it back home.
I think that we just need to bring that pride back to our youth so that they will one day be our elders that held on to that religion and the culture and who they are with pride. If somebody sees a little Paiute kid and say, wow, you're Paiute, you're a rare, one of a kind, and make them feel good.
You know, we walk in two worlds. We have to learn how to balance that. You get too much of one, you get sick in your wholeness.
We're still here, and it's a struggle, but we're still here.
Rural Idaho is a great location for an avid fisherman. Steve Nadal is a retired past president of Dixie State University who came along at just the right time in the history of the school. Dr. Nadal has a BA degree in chemistry, an MBA from Harvard, and a PhD in finance. Somehow he ended up in education.
I had talked to Dallin Oaks about my interest in being a university professor. He made a nomination to the Weber State folks, and I went through the interview process, and the regents hired me at age 43 to be a young president of Weber State College. And so while I was there, Weber went from being Weber State College to Weber State University. A lot of years after Weber, 20 or 25, I got a telephone call in February from the Commissioner of Higher Education, Dave Buehler. Dave said, Steve, we're making a change in leadership at Dixie. Would you be willing to go down and be an interim president for a few months? I said, hang on, Dave. I said, Margaret, you want to go to St. George for a few months? She said, sure. So I said, Dave, I don't need to call you back. There was 3 feet of snow in our backyard. And I said, Dave, we're in. Whenever you want to make that change, we're ready. All of the emotion and feeling that they had for their ancestors and for that countryside, the terrain, the red rocks, All of that and a lot more was encompassed in the term Dixie. And they wanted me to be part of them. And I wanted to, because I knew to be helpful, I had to be accepted. I said, we can do this. And they bought into it. So the regent said, well, why don't you just stay? We'll make you the permanent president. And I said, let's do that. We're in. We're all in. And I said to them, now, let's make this a university. They said, we're going to have a Holland building here, we're going to have a clock tower here, and it's going to signal university. And I was delighted that we could pull it off.
Today, the name has changed to Utah Tech University, with more than 12,000 students, 3 times the entire population of St. George when I was growing up. I can't help but think how amazed my grandpa would be to see the school today and to still feel the spirit that brought us here.
I know there's been a great deal of discussion over, are we losing some of that Dixie pioneer spirit as a result of name changes in our community? I prefer to look at it as progress and as the new iteration.
You know, I'm talking about the fondness that we locals have in this area, but that doesn't translate well in New York City or Denver even. People just don't understand that. And I think it's a service to the students to be able to have on their resumes Utah Tech University. So it's I think, just a natural evolution that had to happen. But I don't think there's any need to abandon that tradition.
We first came here on campus, my family, we went to the encampment mall, and my father-in-law pointed out to me, he says, you know, one of your descendants is on here, Israel Dodge Alphin, and he pointed to the name. And so I think about that all the time. As the president of the university, I not only have an obligation to every student that steps foot on our campus, every community member that supports this university, but it's also my personal family. I have to live up to that legacy that they have left for us. So when I came on campus, I saw the new Holland building, and you could feel the wonderful progress that had been made. But I also looked at the mural, and you could see the past. And as I walked around campus, I just felt this tremendous energy of what was, but also what could be. Just in the last 10 years since we've become a university, we've added over 200 academic programs. We also added infrastructure. They said we need state-of-the-art buildings. We also adopted the Polytechnic model, which really emphasizes that hands-on learning and that career readiness. We also increased our enrollment by 50%, which is just unheard of in the United States. We also transitioned our athletics team to Division I. The trailblazing spirit for me is as strong as it's ever been. I really love the story of our new school song because it identifies all the key components of how important our history is to our progress as we move forward into the future.
I grew up being very, very proud of that song was written by my grandpa, by A.K. Hafen. And the song has always been so dear to my heart. It's so awesome, though, as you look at the transition. My son-in-law, Ricky Valadez, wrote the words and the music to the new school song. That's an awesome connection and transition in my heart. As soon as you hear the first beat of the new school song, you immediately realize we're in a new era, we're in a new chapter of this whole Dixie story going forward. And there's some parallels there. In that song, you hear the Red Rocks call.
The Red Rocks call, the journey's on. Tread this dirt and you're never the same. At Utah Tech, it runs in our veins with
Both songs portray a sense of purpose and meaning drawn from this area, and a sense of identity from the past and destiny for the future. I remember the first time I stepped through the magnificent archway of the old Dixie building. I felt like I was stepping onto the shoulders of countless great people I'd never met. We live in a fully enlightened present. But as Alexis de Tocqueville said, when the past no longer illuminates the future, the spirit walks in darkness. There's something profoundly universal about the Dixie story, a story written on the rocks around us. It's a story that always has and always will cast a bright and hopeful light on the future.